Dawn over the open Pacific. The horizon is a razor line between black water and pale sky, and the only sound is the deep hum of turbines pushing 8,500 tons of gray steel through 4-foot swells at 30 knots. On the bridge of an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the watch officer scans a calm sea. Nothing on the visual, nothing on the radio nets, just ocean. Then the SPY-1D radar paints something. Not one contact, not 5. 30. Low, fast, and closing from the northwest. A wall of cheap loitering munitions and quadcopter drones sweeping in at wave-top altitude, throttles wide open, seekers locked. Each one costs roughly $20,000. The ship they are aimed at costs $2 billion. Here's the question the whole Pacific balance rides on. Can one destroyer close the sky against 30 simultaneous threats? And at what price? That is what we are going to walk through today. Step by step, second by second. Not a news headline. A mechanics breakdown. The radar, the weapons, the crew decisions, and the arithmetic that determines whether the ship survives or the swarm wins. Because the answer is more complicated than either side wants to admit. To understand what an Arleigh Burke destroyer is up against in this scenario, you have to understand what a drone swarm actually is, and why it is not the science fiction threat it sounds like. The swarm in this scenario is not a unified artificial intelligence. It is 30 relatively simple platforms. Some are loitering munitions, one-way attack drones with a shape-charge warhead and a cheap electro-optical seeker. Others are commercial-grade quadcopters modified to carry fragmentation payloads. A few are purpose-built naval attack drones with active radar seekers designed to home on the electromagnetic signature of a warship's own radar. The platforms are cheap enough that losing 20 of them to interception is acceptable. The doctrine assumes that even 5 or 6 penetrating hits on a destroyer's topside sensors, missile launchers, or exhaust vents could degrade its combat capability catastrophically. This is not a hypothetical threat. The tactical logic behind drone swarms has been proven in the Black Sea, in the Red Sea, in the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf. The specific scenario we are building, 30 drones, open Pacific, 1 Arleigh Burke, is a synthesis of what naval planners at the Pentagon and Pacific Fleet have been gaming out as the realistic near-term threat in a high-end naval confrontation. The drones themselves echo the kind of platforms a peer adversary with serious naval industrial capacity could field in quantity. Think of something derived from the family of systems that includes the SZ-6 and similar one-way attack platforms, launched from surface vessels or land-based coastal batteries beyond the horizon. What makes this scenario hard, genuinely hard, is not the capability of any individual drone. It is the simultaneity. 30 tracks, arriving roughly together, some at sea-skimming altitude of 15 to 20 feet, some at 200 feet to complicate radar coverage, some approaching from slightly different bearings to stress the fire control geometry. The swarm is designed to saturate a single ship's engagement timeline. Some of the platforms have been pre-programmed with waypoint sequences designed to arrive from multiple quadrants within a 30-second window, forcing the fire control system to split its attention across multiple approach vectors simultaneously, degrading the probability of kill on each individual track. Now let us build the ship that has to stop it. The Arleigh Burke destroyer has been the backbone of U.S. surface warfare since the early 1990s, and the Flight 3 variant operating today is a substantially different machine from the original design. The hull and turbines are familiar. The combat system is not. Aegis, the AN/SPY-1D, or the newer SPY-6 radar in the most recent hulls, is not a weapon. It is a battle management system, a combination of phased array radar, fire control computers, and a command and control architecture that does what a human crew cannot do at machine speed. It tracks hundreds of contacts simultaneously, classifies them by threat level, assigns engagement solutions, and recommends, or in some modes executes. Weapons release, all faster than a human operator can consciously process the data. The ship's weapons for this scenario are layered. Furthest out, SM-6 interceptors in the vertical launch system, capable of engaging aerial targets at ranges well beyond 50 nautical miles and at altitudes from sea skimming to the upper atmosphere. Mid-layer, SM-2 Block 3 missiles, somewhat older but still highly effective against subsonic aerial threats at medium range. The 5-inch MiG-45 gun, an automated naval cannon firing at up to 20 rounds per minute. Handles threats the missiles hand off or miss at ranges out to about 10 nautical miles. And then the last wall, the Phalanx CIWS Block 1B, a 20 mm 61 Vulcan rotary cannon on a self-contained mount that operates entirely autonomously. The Phalanx does not need a human decision. It detects, tracks, and fires on its own at a cyclic rate of 4,500 rounds per minute against targets inside roughly 1 nautical mile, the inner bubble. the last chance. What this ship does not have, and this matters, is infinite ammunition. The vertical launch system carries 96 cells. Not all of them are loaded with interceptors. Some hold land attack Tomahawk cruise missiles, some hold anti-submarine weapons. A realistic combat load might have 32 to 40 SM-6 and SM-2 rounds available for air defense. Against a 30-drone swarm, that ratio is close. Very close. Here is the complication that changes the arithmetic. Not every drone in the swarm deserves an SM-6. And the Aegis system knows it, but the crew has to trust the machine fast enough to act on its recommendations before the engagement timeline collapses. Let us run the scenario. 30 drones. The Arleigh Burke is operating independently, not inside a carrier strike group, not with air cover from F/A-18 Super Hornets overhead. Just the ship, its crew, and its systems. Dawn. Sea State 2. The SPY-1D radar picks up the first contacts at approximately 40 nautical miles. At wave-skimming altitude, a drone flying at 200 knots gives the ship roughly 12 minutes before it enters the outer engagement envelope. At higher altitude, radar detection range increases and engagement time stretches, but the drones in this scenario are flying low, on purpose. Some of them will not appear on radar until they are inside 20 miles. That is where the timeline compresses hard. The Aegis combat system begins building tracks the moment the radar paints the first contact. Within seconds, it has 30 distinct tracks. It classifies them. Are they maneuvering? Are they radiating a seeker signal? Are any of them exhibiting the flight profile of an anti-radiation drone designed to home on the ship's own radar emissions? That last category, if any of the 30 are anti-radiation seekers, means the SPY-1D itself is a target, and turning it off to deny them a lock means going blind at the worst possible moment. What is most surprising about this engagement geometry is not the number of drones. It is the decision compression. From first radar contact to inter-bubble engagement, the crew has roughly 8 to 10 minutes of real decision time. Within that window, they have to identify which drones get expensive interceptors, which get the gun, and which are low enough priority to absorb EW spoofing and hope the seeker loses lock. The Aegis system recommends an engagement sequence. The commanding officer and the TAO, the tactical action officer, review and execute. In the first 30 seconds after contact acquisition, 2 SM-6 missiles come out of the VLS cells in rapid succession. The crew in the Combat Information Center works in near silence, each station focused on its own piece of the track picture, voices clipped and precise over the internal circuit as status calls come up from the weapons control consoles. The CO stands behind the TAO, watching the screen, not intervening, because intervening now would slow everything down. The SM-6 is a genuinely remarkable weapon. It uses a dual-mode seeker, active radar homing in terminal phase, with mid-course guidance from the ship's fire control. That allows it to engage targets the ship cannot directly track through line-of-sight limitations. Against a drone flying at 50 feet of altitude, 40 miles out, the SM-6 climbs, curves over, and dives onto the target from above, closing it over Mach 3.5. Impact. 2 drones down, 28 remaining. But here's the ugly math. 2 SM-6 rounds just spent approximately $2 million to neutralize $40,000 of threat. The cost-exchange ratio is 50 to 1 in the swarm's favor, and the Aegis system is already recommending the next salvo. The engagement is now fully inside 8 minutes. The swarm is closing fast, and the Arleigh Burke's crew is running the hardest calculus in modern naval warfare. Which threats get missiles, and which ones get something cheaper. This is where the layered defense doctrine actually earns its complexity. Not every drone in the swarm is equal. The Aegis system's track files show variation. Some are flying direct courses at constant speed, the easiest intercept geometry. Some are maneuvering slightly, varying altitude, which makes fire control harder. And a few, the ones with active radar seekers pinging the ship, are categorized as the highest priority. Because if even one of those gets through to sensor range of the SPY-1D, it targets the ship's eyes first. The TAO sequences the engagement to handle the highest priority tracks first with SM-6, then steps down to SM-2 for the medium priority group. The SM-2 block through IC is older but still fast and accurate against subsonic targets. At this point in the engagement, roughly 4 minutes from initial contact, 8 SM missiles have been fired. 10 drones are down or have lost lock under electronic jamming. 20 remain. Here is where the obstacle becomes real. The ship's AN/SLQ-32 electronic warfare system, the Slick 32, is actively jamming the cheap electro-optical seekers on the commercial derivative quadcopters. It pumps out noise in the frequency bands those seekers use to discriminate a target. On a good day, In benign electromagnetic conditions, it can cause a seeker to lose lock and drive the drone off course into the water. On this dawn in the Pacific, with the swarm's designers having anticipated jamming and preloaded some seekers with GPS waypoint backup navigation, it works on maybe half the EW vulnerable platforms. 5 drones fall into the ocean, seekers confused, engines still running until they hit the surface. 15 remain, and the closest of them is now inside 12 nautical miles. The 5-inch MiG-45 gun opens up. This is a weapon most people underestimate in the drone context. The MiG-45 fires standard naval ammunition at naval surface or land targets. But with the MiG-53 guided projectile round, it can engage aerial targets with radar proximity fusing. It is not a precision missile. It is a burst of shrapnel at a calculated point in space that a drone has to fly through. At a sustained rate of 20 rounds per minute, against drones flying at relatively predictable low-altitude profiles, the 5-inch gun can engage multiple targets in sequence with a sustained volume of fire that does not draw on the VLS cells. 3 more drones come apart in midair inside 6 miles. Fragments of cheap composite airframe spin into the ocean. 12 remain. The closest is now at 4 nautical miles and closing at 200 knots, roughly 70 seconds from the ship. Here's the question worth sitting with right here in the middle of this engagement, because it is the question the entire Pacific strategic calculus turns on. When a cheap swarm forces you to spend down your expensive interceptors, is the ship better off shooting down every single drone, or changing tactics to absorb hits on non-critical systems and preserve missiles for the next wave? Because this swarm might not be alone. The platforms that launched these 30 drones might be preparing a second salvo. And a destroyer that has exhausted its VLS cells defending against Wave 1 has nothing but the Phalanx and the gun left for Wave 2. Put yourself in the TAO's position for a second. 45 seconds to inner bubble contact. 12 drones still flying. 6 SM rounds left in the air defense load. The gun still cycling. And the Phalanx spinning up. What do you prioritize? We will come back to that. The answer, in the US Navy's actual layered defense doctrine, is deliberate triage, and the Aegis system was built specifically to enable it at a speed humans cannot match manually. The 6 remaining SM rounds in the active load are assigned to the 6 drones with the highest estimated probability of hitting critical systems. The 2 active radar seekers still closing, and the 4 that have taken the most direct approach vectors toward the ship's combat system superstructure. The MiG-45 continues cycling on the cluster approaching from the port quarter. The SLQ-32 holds jamming focus on the 3 quadcopters from the south that are the most EW vulnerable remaining. At 2 nautical miles, the Phalanx CIWS Block 1B acquires its first targets autonomously. The human crew does not fire the Phalanx. They switched it to auto-engage mode during the first minute of the engagement. It has been waiting, radar spinning, computing intercept solutions, holding fire because targets were outside its effective engagement range. Now they are not. The Phalanx opens fire with a sound that everyone who has heard it describes the same way, like a very large chainsaw. The 20mm tungsten penetrators go out in bursts, optimized by the system's own fire control. Not a continuous stream, but calculated pulses timed to the target's predicted position at a specific range gate. The effective engagement envelope is roughly 300 meters to 1 nautical mile. Inside that bubble, against a target flying in a straight line at constant altitude, the Phalanx's hit probability per burst is high. Not perfect, but high enough that multiple bursts against multiple targets in rapid sequence can close the sky. 4 drones come down inside the Phalanx engagement zone. 3 drones are now inside 500 meters. One of the remaining SM-6 rounds catches one of them in terminal phase at 800 meters. A last-second intercept that leaves debris falling just off the port bow. The second drone. A loitering munition that survived jamming, survived the gun, survived the outer intercepts. Takes a fragmentation burst from the Phalanx at roughly 250 meters, not a clean kill. The warhead does not detonate, but the airframe is shredded enough that the seeker loses gimbal lock. The drone corkscrews into the sea 40 meters from the hull. The shockwave is felt on deck. The third drone. The one the Phalanx swung to engage after clearing the second. It catches a burst at 180 meters. The warhead detonates on contact with the penetrators. Fragments skip off the destroyer's hull. The superstructure is armored for exactly this possibility. The external surfaces hardened against fragmentation. The blast concussion rattles the bridge windows. A small fire starts on the weather deck from burning composite material. The fire team has it out in 90 seconds. The swarm is finished. 30 drones launched. 30 drones down or detonated. 28 definitively destroyed. 1 a non-detonating impact in the ocean. 1 a fragmentation detonation close aboard with minor material damage. The ship is operational. The radar is up. the engines are running, but the VLS cells are significantly depleted. And somewhere over the horizon, the platform that launched this swarm is calculating whether to send a second wave. Here is what actually decided this engagement, and it is not the answer most people expect. It was not the SM-6, though the SM-6 is genuinely one of the best long-range air defense interceptors ever built. It was not the Phalanx, though the Phalanx closed the final gap in a way nothing else could. It was not even the Aegis combat system's tracking speed, though that track prioritization in the first 30 seconds was the single most decisive act in the entire sequence. What decided this engagement was crew training and doctrine integration. Specifically, the decision to trust the Aegis system's engagement sequence recommendations and not override them with manual fire control. Every second a TAO spends second-guessing the automated track-to-weapon assignment is a second the swarm closes distance. The U.S. Navy's surface warfare training pipeline has spent years drilling crews on exactly this: when to trust the machine, when to override it, and how to manage the transition between fire control modes under stress. In a 30-track simultaneous engagement, a crew that hesitates on those mode transitions loses the timeline. The harder truth is the one the Navy itself acknowledges in its unclassified assessments of magazine depth. The cost exchange in this scenario was punishing. 30 drones neutralized at a cost of approximately 14 to 18 SM interceptors, plus significant gun ammunition, plus EW system power draw. A realistic combat load expended roughly 40 to 50% of its VLS air defense inventory to defeat one swarm. One detail that stuck with me going through the surface warfare literature on this: the Phalanx was designed in the 1970s as a last-ditch close-in weapon against anti-ship missiles. It works against drones, works well, but its ammunition load of 1,500 rounds is finite. Against a sustained multi-wave swarm attack, a ship that has expended its Phalanx ammunition and its VLS interceptors is not defenseless, but it is dramatically more vulnerable than it was at the start of the engagement. The magazine is the real limit, not the radar, not the weapon accuracy. The magazine. Here is the take that will probably get some pushback. The U.S. Navy's layered defense against drone swarms is effective, but it was not designed for the cost exchange environment a peer adversary with serious industrial capacity creates. The Phalanx was not designed to be the economical solution. It was designed to be the reliable last resort. Leaning on it as a primary cost-effective counter to cheap swarms, which some analysts have proposed, understates how quickly it consumes its own ammunition magazine against a sustained attack. The real answer to cheap swarms is not cheaper interceptors. It is directed energy weapons with a near zero cost per shot. The Navy's high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance system, Helios, and the optical dazzling interdictor, Navy, Odeon, are the right long-term answer. They are being fielded now, but they are not yet on every Arleigh Burke. And until they are, the cost exchange problem remains real. Here's what this means for the Pacific balance, and why this scenario matters beyond the tactical mechanics of one ship on one morning. The drone swarm tactic is not a Chinese invention and not an American one. It is a logical response to the cost structure of modern naval warfare. A peer adversary with significant naval shipbuilding and munitions production capacity. And China's People's Liberation Army Navy now launches more warship tonnage per year than any other navy on Earth, can produce the platforms to field these swarms at a rate that strains U.S. industrial capacity to replace interceptors. The Type 055 destroyer and the Fujian-class carrier that anchor the planned surface force are not drone swarm platforms. They are high-end conventional warships. But behind them, coastal defense forces, submarine-launched drone carriers, and land-based anti-ship systems like the DF-21D and DF-26 create a layered access denial environment in the Western Pacific that pushes U.S. surface ships further from the first island chain and forces them to operate in a threat environment where swarm attacks are not a hypothetical. They are a planning assumption. The Arleigh Burke in this scenario survived. Operationally capable, crew intact, no significant structural damage. But it did not survive unscathed in the resupply sense. A VLS cell cannot be reloaded at sea. The SM-6 rounds expended in this engagement must be replaced in port, in Yokosuka, in Guam, in Pearl Harbor. In a sustained high-tempo conflict in the Western Pacific, the distance between the threat and the replenishment point becomes a strategic factor. The ship can fight, but it cannot fight indefinitely on one load. The U.S. Navy knows this. Pacific Fleet exercises have been gaming multi-salvo, multi-wave scenarios for years. The answer the service has been building toward has three components. Directed energy weapons to handle cheap threats at near zero cost per shot. distributed maritime operations doctrine that does not concentrate high-value ships in single-target packages, and cooperative engagement capability that allows multiple ships and aircraft to share fire control data and shoot from each other's track files. An F/A-18 Super Hornet carrying an AIM-120 AMRAAM can engage a drone track cued by a destroyer's SPY-1D radar without the ship expending its own VLS rounds. The kill is shared. The magazine depth is effectively expanded across the force. That is the real answer to the drone swarm in the Pacific. Not one ship with perfect systems, but a networked kill web where the threat has to defeat not a single Aegis computer, but an entire connected fleet. Most people assume the Phalanx is the end of the story, the last wall that closes the battle. It is not. The Phalanx is a symptom of the real story, which is about the cost exchange that shapes everything before the drones ever get that close. Every SM-6 fired at a $20,000 drone is a choice about what the next engagement looks like. And in the Western Pacific, where distances are vast and replenishment is measured in days of steaming, those choices accumulate. Is this the Navy changing tactics, or just spending down faster? Comment YES or no. We genuinely want to know how you read this before the next wave of analysis drops. 30 drones, 90 seconds of engagement timeline. One Arleigh Burke that fought through every layer of its own defense architecture, radar to missile, to gun to CIWS, and closed the sky. The ship won. But what strikes me about this scenario is that the winning condition is narrower than it looks from the outside. The margin between 30 drones down, ship operational, and swarm forces critical system damage is not the size of the radar or the sophistication of the Aegis computer. It is the magazine. It is the crew training. It is the decision in the first 30 seconds about which drones get the expensive interceptors and which ones get gambled on electronic warfare. Here is the open question worth sitting with after everything we have walked through. When cheap swarms force you to spend down your expensive interceptors at a 50-to-1 cost disadvantage, is the strategic answer to shoot down every drone, or to build the directed energy systems that change the cost equation entirely? Both paths carry a price. The first preserves the ship, but strains the magazine. The second requires years of technology development during which the threat keeps coming. The Pacific does not give you the luxury of answering that question at leisure. Drop your take in the comments. And if you want to see how a carrier strike group handles a saturation attack with both anti-ship missiles and drone swarms coordinated simultaneously, that breakdown is next.